She was hired to teach his daughter scales on the piano. Within a season, the railroad baron of Ironvale was asking her opinion on everything else. No one in the house could have told you exactly when it happened. Not Whitfield, who noticed everything and said nothing. Not the housekeeper, who complained about it to anyone who'd listen. Certainly not Baron Thomas Reed himself, who would have denied it entirely, right up until the night a brooch went missing from the drawing room, and he discovered exactly how much he had to lose. Ironvale in those years was a town built on the particular arithmetic of steel and steam, a place where fortunes rose out of furnace smoke, and men who had been nobody a decade earlier now dined off silver their grandfathers would not have recognized. The Reed estate sat at the edge of it, on a low rise above the river, close enough to hear the mills at certain hours, and far enough to pretend, most of the time, that one couldn't. This is the story of how Margaret Ellery, a woman the county had quietly agreed to stop noticing, became impossible for one man to stop noticing at all. It begins, as these things often do, with a lie everyone had agreed to believe. 3 years before she ever set foot in the Reed house, Margaret Ellery had a different name in every ballroom in the county. Not because she'd married and changed it, because she hadn't needed to. Ellery Bank had underwritten half the mills between here and the coast, and the Ellery name opened doors the way money always does, quietly, without anyone having to ask. She remembered that life now, the way one remembers a dream upon waking, vivid in fragments, useless as a whole. The smell of her mother's rosewater, the particular weight of a good silk gown. Her father, home late from the bank most nights but never too tired to ask about her day, to listen as though her opinions on a novel or a dress pattern were matters of real consequence. Then Ellery Bank failed in a single terrible week, the way these things do, not slowly, the way a candle burns down, but all at once, the way a candle is snuffed. There were reasons, complicated ones, involving a partner who had gambled the bank's reserves on a copper venture that collapsed before the ink dried on the papers. Margaret's father had trusted that partner for 11 years. He never said the man's name again after the collapse, not once, not even at the end. It didn't matter, in the end, whose fault it was. What mattered was that the Ellery name went from a door opener to a door closer in the space of one newspaper headline, and that the same families who had dined at their table for a decade found, with remarkable speed, that they no longer had room on their guest lists. Margaret watched it happen in real time, an invitation withdrawn here, a visit that was somehow always inconvenient there, until by the second month, there was no one left to withdraw from at all. Her father did not survive the winter that followed. Some said his heart simply stopped. Others, more quietly, said it stopped because he made it stop. That a man who had built something out of nothing and watched it taken from him by another man's carelessness had simply run out of reasons to keep his own machinery running. Margaret never asked which was true. She had learned, by then, that some questions are kinda left unanswered, and that grief did not require an explanation to be real. What she was left with was a mother too proud to accept Charry do much, beyond sit by a window and mourn a life that had ended before her husband did. There was a modest house that took 11 months to sell for a third of its worth, because word travels fast in a small county, and no one wished to be seen paying full price to a rucation that had prepared her beautifully for exactly nothing a ruined woman could use. French conversation, watercolor painting, the correct manner of addressing a duke's second son, none of it worth a single week's bread. And all of it, in its way, a kind of cruelty. Silly how far she had fallen without teaching her anything useful about how to climb back up. Her mother died 18 months after her father, quietly, in her sleep, in a rented room above a milliner's shop that smelled permanently of starch and dye. Margaret buried her with what remained of the money, frommanding at the grave in a borrowed black dress, that she was entirely alone in the world for the first time in her 23 years, and that no one was coming to fix this for her. Governessing, when the offer finally came through the clergyman who had known her father, was not a fall. It was a rope thrown to a woman already in the water. Margaret took it without complaint, packed one trunk of fashionable, and were now merely serviceable, and arrived at the Reed House on a grey Tuesday morning with a letter of reference and a silence around her past that she intended to keep for exactly as long as it served her. She was not the first governess Clara Reed had gone through. Count, the fourth in 2 years, and the general expectation below stairs was that she would not last the season either. Not because Clara was difficult, though she was shy in a way that made impatient adults uncomfortable, but because the last 3 governesses had eco-wen patience with a 6-year-old who stuttered so badly on certain consonants that she'd simply stopped speaking to anyone outside the household at all. The first governess had tried correcting her constantly, finishing every stuck word before Clara could get to it, until the girl stopped attempting words that gave her trouble at all, and her vocabulary shrank, had lost her temper more than once, calling the stutter an affectation that firmness would cure, and had lasted 11 weeks before Thomas dismissed her personally. The third had simply been indifferent, competent, correct, and entirely uninterested in a child who he position paid for. Margaret did not run out of patience. She had, if anything, auricular endless patience of a woman who has already lost everything once, and found, to her own surprise, that she survived it. She sat with Clara through the stumbling, silent lessons. She did not finish the child's sentences for her, the way the others had, in a hurry waited, hands folded, face open, exactly as long as it took, and let Clara understand, slowly, over weeks, that no answer would ever be too slow in coming to be worth the wait. It took a month before Clara spoke to her unprompted. It took 2 before she laughed out loud in Margaret's presence, a real laugh, startled out of her by something in a book they were reading together, somewhere that neither of them had gone looking for, and that Margaret, who had not let herself grow attached to anything since the funeral, found herself unable to guard against. Below stairs, Margaret Ellery was announced, when she was announced at all, as the governess, not Miss Ellery. Not even Margaret, just the governess, the way one might refer to a piece of useful furniture. Chiang, because flinching cost more than she had left to spend, and she had long since decided that the county could call her whatever it liked, as long as it left her enough dignity to do her work. By late summer, Clara had begun asking, some mornings, whether they might have their lesson in the garden instead of the schoolroom, and Margaret, who understood that a request like that was itself a kind of progress, nearly always said yes. The garden party that changed everything was, by Ironvale standards, a modest affair. Vivian Ashcroft's idea of a small gathering of friends, which meant perhaps 80 guests, 3 separate refreshment tables, and an orchestra imported at some expense from 2 counties over. Vivian had been arranging small gatherings of friends at the Reed estate with increasing frequency for the better part of a year, ever since Thomas Reed's period of mourning for his late wife had technically, if not emotionally, come to its end. Clara had been anxious about the party for days beforehand. In the quiet, contained way she was anxious about most things involving strangers. Margaret spent the morning of the event helping her practice saying her own name. not to correct the stutter, which correction never helped, but simply so the sound of it would feel less unfamiliar in her mouth if anyone asked. "You don't have to say it perfectly," Margaret told her, tying the sash on Clara's good dress. "You only have to say it at all, in your own time, and anyone who can't wait that long isn't worth the trouble of answering." Margaret had not been invited to the party. Precisely. Governesses rarely were. But Clara had been asked to make a brief appearance, dressed, presented, and returned to the nursery within the hour, the way children of a certain class were trotted out and put away again, and Margaret's presence was required to manage the transition. It was going smoothly enough for the better part of that hour. Clara stayed close to Margaret's side, answered the few questions put to her, with careful, halting sentences that no one seemed to mind, and had even begun, cautiously, to enjoy the lemonade and the music. It was going smoothly right up until Vivian's niece, a girl of perhaps 10, with her aunt's particular talent for finding the softest place to press, cornered Clara near the refreshment table and asked her, in front of 4 other children, to say her own name 3 times fast. Clara tried. The stutter caught hard on the first consonant, the way it always did under pressure, and by the 3rd attempt, she had gone red and silent, and was staring at her own shoes with the particular stillness of a child trying very hard not to cry in public. The other children laughed. Not cruelly, exactly. The careless laughter of children who don't yet understand what they're laughing at. But laughter all the same, and Vivian's niece looked entirely too pleased with the reaction she'd produced. Margaret had spent 3 years being careful. 3 years of governess silence, of knowing her place, of swallowing exactly the kind of remark she was about to make. She swallowed none of it now. "She can say it just fine," Margaret said, stepping between Clara and the circle of children, her voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to, and not an inch further. "The trouble isn't her tongue. It's that some people find it entertaining to watch a child struggle, which tells you a great deal more about them than it does about her." The garden went quiet, in that particular way. A garden goes quiet when everyone has heard something they weren't meant to hear. Vivian's niece flushed. And from somewhere just behind Margaret's left shoulder, close enough, it turned out, to have heard every single word, came a voice she did not immediately place. "That," said Baron Thomas Reed, "is precisely what I've been trying to say to my sister for years, and rather more politely than I should have." Margaret turned. She had spoken to her employer perhaps a dozen times in 3 months, always briefly, always about Clara's lessons, always with her eyes somewhere in the vicinity of his collar rather than his face. She looked at him properly now, dark-eyed, tired around the edges in the way men who run railroads are tired, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name and didn't have time to study, because Clara had chosen that exact moment to slip her small hand into Margaret's and whisper, with only the faintest catch, that she wanted to go inside now, please. Margaret took her inside. Behind them, she heard Thomas say something further to the gathered children, quiet, unhurried, the kind of correction that didn't need to be loud to be final. But she did not look back to see whether he was still watching. She could feel that he was. That evening, once Clara was asleep, Thomas found Margaret in the corridor outside the nursery, still awake, still turning the afternoon over in her mind. "You needn't have worried on my account," he said, "about speaking so plainly, in front of my guests." "I wasn't thinking of your guests when I said it," Margaret admitted, before she could decide whether that was wise to say aloud. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close to one. "No," he agreed. I don't imagine you were. Vivian Ashcroft had spent the better part of a year building, brick by careful brick, the case for becoming the next Baroness Reed. It was not a passionate case. Vivian did not deal in passion. She dealt in arithmetic, and the arithmetic of marrying Thomas Reed was, by her calculation, close to unimprovable. He was widowed, wealthy, still young enough to matter, and, crucially, in want of a mother for his daughter, a role Vivian had been auditioning for, with a patience that cost her considerable effort and revealed absolutely nothing of her actual feelings toward children in general, or Clara in particular. The governess had never featured in this arithmetic. Governesses were staff. Staff did not become variables. But Vivian had watched, from a distance that afternoon, the particular way Thomas Reed's expression had changed while Margaret Ellery spoke, the way his tired eyes had sharpened, the way he'd laughed afterward at something Vivian herself hadn't found remotely funny, and she recalculated. Quickly, and without sentiment. Thomas, for his part, had reasons of his own for being wary of anything that resembled arithmetic in a marriage, though he rarely spoke of them. His first wife, Eleanor, had been chosen for him in exactly the manner Vivian was now angling to repeat. Good family, good connections, an alliance that satisfied his own father's ambitions more than it had ever satisfied Thomas himself. He had grown fond of Eleanor, in time, the particular fondness of two people who have committed to sharing a life and made the best of the commitment. He had grieved her honestly when the fever took her, 4 years past now. But he had never once, in 8 years of marriage, felt the thing he now found himself feeling in small, unsettling increments whenever Margaret Ellery discussed vowel sounds with his daughter, patient and unhurried, as though the world contained nothing more urgent than helping one small girl find her voice. He told himself, for a while, that it was gratitude. Clara had changed more in 4 months under Margaret's care than in 2 years under anyone else's, and gratitude was a reasonable thing for a father to feel toward the woman responsible. He told himself this for as long as it remained convincing, which turned out to be a shorter span than he'd expected. Vivian noticed everything. That was, in the end, her particular talent. She began, carefully, to plant small doubts in small places. A comment to the housekeeper about how unusual it was for a governess to take her meals with the family so often now. A remark to Thomas himself, delve out how a man in his position ought to be thinking of Clara's marriage prospects eventually, and what sort of connections a governess's influence might or might not provide in that regard. None of it was accusation. All of it was arithmetic, applied patiently. The tone. She was not above smaller cruelties either, dressed as kind Neweek, an expensive thing with real hair, accompanied by a nougat, suggesting the child might enjoy a proper lady's company more than the schoolroom, a phrase pointed enough that even Clara, 6 years old, and no student of adult cruelty, sensed something unkind beneath usual bluntness. Why Miss Ashcroft didn't like her governess. Margaret told her, carefully, that grown women sometimes had nothing to do with a child at all, and that Clara needn't worry about any of it. It was, she thought privately, the most diplomatic lie she had told in years. Thomas noticed the doubts being planted, and found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, uninterested in tending them. He began, without entirely deciding to, seeking out small excuses to be in the schoolroom about the household accounts that could easily have waited, a book he claimed to be looking for, on the shelf nearest Clara's desk. He told himself these were coincidences for as long as the excuses held, and stopped bothering with the excuses at all by early autumn, see some afternoons to watch, unannounced, until Margaret grew accustomed to glancing up and finding him there. He was, by then, no longer certain gratitude was the correct word for what he felt. The not being certain worried him more than he let anyone see, not because the feeling itself troubled him, but because he under rarity of a man who had once made a marriage out of arithmetic, exactly how much trouble a feeling like this could cause a woman, with no standing to defend herself if it went wrong. It was Whitfield who noticed the ring. Whitfield had served the Reed house for 30 years, first under Thomas's father, and now under Thomas, and in 30 years he had developed a habit of noticing things and keeping his conclusions to himself, until keeping them served no one. He noticed, one afternoon in early October, that Margaret Ellery wore a small ring on a chain beneath her collar, tucked out of sight, the way a woman tucks away something she doesn't wish to explain, visible for only a moment, when she leaned down to help Clara with her shoes, and the chain slipped free of its hiding place. He noticed, because he had once, in decades earlier, attended a ball at Ellery House as a young footman new to service, exactly whose ring it was. A particular sapphire setting, quite distinctive, that had belonged to the lady of that house, a woman he remembered as gracious to the staff, in a way not every hostess bothered to be, and whose daughter, if his memory served, had been a bright, watchful child of perhaps 8 or 9 at the time, given to sitting on the stairs during her parents' parties and observing the adults with an attention well beyond her years. He said nothing to Margaret. He did, 3 days later, find a private moment with the Baron. "You'll forgive an old man's memory, sir," Whitfield said, in the careful tone he used when he intended to say something significant, while appearing to say something incidental. "But I served punch at Ellery House once, before your time, sir, when the name still meant something in this county. There was a ring the lady of the house wore, a particular sapphire setting. I noticed it again recently, on Miss Ellery's hand, sir, though she keeps it well hidden." Thomas set down the ledger he'd been pretending to read. "Ellery," he repeated slowly, and watched 3 months of careful, deliberate silence rearrange itself into an entirely different shape in his mind. Ellery Bank, the failure everyone remembered and no one discussed, out of the particular embarrassed courtesy the wealthy extend to families who have recently stopped being wealthy. He had, he realized, met the elder Ellery once or twice himself, years ago, at some function or other, and had thought nothing of it since. "You're telling me my daughter's governess is that Ellery?" "I am telling you nothing, sir," Whitfield said, with the perfect neutrality of a man who has just told him everything. "I am merely remarking on a ring." Thomas did not confront Margaret with it directly. He was not entirely certain, afterward, why not, whether it was tact, or cowardice, or some instinct that told him she would tell him herself when she was ready, and that pressing her before then would cost him something he wasn't willing to spend. He simply began, from that afternoon forward, to see her differently, not as staff who had once, perhaps, seen better days, but as a woman who had lost everything a person can lose without losing herself, and had rebuilt an entire life, in near total silence, out of nothing but patience, and a willingness to be underestimated by everyone who mattered. He found himself, over the following weeks, watching for the small signs of her old life beneath the governess's careful composure, the correct French she used without thinking when reading to Clara from a storybook, the unconscious grace with which she poured tea, the particular way she still, after everything, held herself like a woman who had once expected to be looked at, rather than overlooked. It did not make him love her, not yet, not in any way he was prepared to name, but it made him watch her the way a man watches something he has only just realized he cannot afford to lose. And it made him, on one quiet evening in the library, when Clara had long since gone to bed, and Margaret had stayed behind to return a borrowed book, ask her, gently, whether she had always intended to be a governess, or whether life had simply arranged itself that way. Margaret looked at him a long moment, weighing, he thought, exactly how much of the truth she was willing to spend on the question. "Life arranged a great many things I didn't intend," she said finally. "I found it easier, on the whole, not to dwell on which ones." He did not push further, but he understood, from the careful way she'd answered, that she knew he knew, or suspected as much, and that she had chosen, for now, to let the silence between them remain exactly where she'd placed it. He respected the choice, even as it left him wanting, more than he was entirely comfortable admitting, to be the one person she didn't feel she had to guard herself against. The brooch disappeared on a Thursday, while Thomas was in the city on railroad business and not expected back for 4 days. It was a modest piece by Reed standards, a garnet and gold thing that had belonged to Thomas's mother, kept in the drawing-room cabinet, more from sentiment than security, since no one in the household had ever imagined a need to guard it closely. Its absence was discovered by the housekeeper on Thursday evening, during her usual round of closing up the downstairs rooms, and the household spent an uneasy night speculating in low voices about how such a thing could have happened in a house that prided itself on the honesty of its staff. Its location was discovered by Vivian Ashcroft, who had arrived Friday morning, uninvited but not unwelcome, to keep Clara company, as a favor, during her father's absence, in Margaret's sewing basket, tucked beneath a half-finished collar, in a manner too careless to have been placed there by anyone actually attempting to steal it, though no one present that morning was thinking clearly enough to notice the carelessness for what it was. Margaret would spend a long time afterward, turning over the details, trying to understand exactly how it had been done, and would never entirely succeed in reconstructing it, only in understanding, much later, precisely who had done it and why. What she understood immediately, standing in the drawing room while the housekeeper held the brooch aloft, like evidence at a trial, was that it did not matter how it had been done. It mattered only that it had been found, and that the household, in the master's absence, with no one senior enough present to demand real proof, was prepared to believe exactly what it was shown. "I did not take it," Margaret said, and heard, even as she said it, how thin the words sounded against the weight of a found object. "Of course you'll say that," Vivian said, not unkindly. Vivian was rarely unkind in tone, only in effect. "But really, Miss Ellery, we all know the family's circumstances have been difficult. No one would think less of you for a moment of weakness. It's only human." It was, Margaret understood, a performance staged for an audience of exactly the right size, large enough to spread as gossip through the household within the hour, small enough that no one present had the standing to challenge Vivian Ashcroft's account of events. The housekeeper, who had never quite warmed to a governess who ate with the family more often than seemed proper, was inclined to believe the worst, and said so, twice, in a voice pitched to be overheard. The other servants, who liked Margaret well enough, but valued their positions more, found it safer to say nothing at all, to look at the floor, or their own hands, and let the moment pass over them without comment. Margaret was given 1 hour to pack. She used most of it sitting very still on the edge of her narrow bed, trying and failing to think of a single person in the county who would take her word over an Ashcroft's, and finding, at the end of the hour, that the answer was simply no one. that 3 years of careful, deliberate invisibility had left her with no reputation of her own to stand on, only the borrowed shadow of a name everyone had agreed to stop remembering. Clara, told only that her governess had had to leave suddenly, found Margaret in the corridor as she was carrying her trunk down, and cried in a way that broke on every consonant of Margaret's name. The particular stutter Margaret had spent months teaching her not to fear, now returning in full force under the weight of a loss the child didn't understand, and hadn't been given the words to ask about. Margaret knelt and held her for exactly as long as she dared, forbidden from explaining, terrified that explaining would only make things worse, and left without being able to say goodbye properly at all, only a whispered promise, half true and half hope, that Clara would be all right. She walked the 4 miles to the boarding house in town, in the cold, in a dress she'd need to sell within the week if she wanted to eat, carrying a trunk that felt heavier with every mile. The room she found was small and cold, and smelled faintly of someone else's cooking through the thin wall, and she sat on its narrow bed that first night, with what remained of her savings counted out in small piles on the blanket, calculating, the way she had once calculated the family's mounting debts as a girl of 20, watching her father's world collapse from a front-row seat she'd never asked for, exactly how many weeks she had before the money ran out entirely. She told herself, the way she had told herself once before, that she had survived losing everything and would survive it again. She did not entirely believe it, that first night. But she blew out the candle, and she kept breathing, and in the morning she began, methodically, the grim business of writing to every household in 3 counties that might conceivably need a governess, with no current reference to offer. Thomas Reed returned home Monday evening to a house in quiet disarray, a daughter who would not stop asking when Miss Ellery was coming back, and a story from his household that did not, on close examination, hold together at all. He asked the obvious question first. Who had discovered the brooch? Vivian, the housekeeper told him. He asked the second, less obvious question. Who had been present in the house between Thursday and Friday morning, with access to both the drawing-room cabinet and Margaret's sewing basket? The answer, once he pressed for it properly, standing in his own study, voice level, refusing to let the housekeeper rush past the question the way she clearly wished to, was considerably shorter than the household had initially implied, and Vivian Ashcroft's name sat plainly on it, since she had been in the house both evenings, ostensibly minding Clara, with the run of every room in it. He did not confront her immediately. He was, by nature, a careful man, the kind who built railroads by checking every joint twice before trusting his weight to it, and he intended to check this one properly before he said a word. He asked Whitfield, quietly, the way he'd learned to ask Whitfield things, in a tone that assumed discretion without needing to request it, to make certain inquiries among the staff, the kind of inquiries a butler could make in the servants' hall that a master never could. Whitfield returned within a day, with a scullery maid's quiet, frightened account. A girl no more than 16, terrified of losing her position, who would only speak at all once Whitfield had promised, in his own name and with his own authority behind it, that her position was safe, regardless of what she said. She had seen the lady near the drawing-room cabinet on Thursday afternoon, she admitted, and near Miss Ellery's sewing basket shortly after, though she hadn't thought anything of it at the time, since ladies of Miss Ashcroft's standing weren't the sort one questioned. It was not, strictly, proof a court would have accepted. It was, for Thomas's purposes, entirely sufficient, and it was compounded, the following morning, by a second discovery that removed any remaining doubt. He confronted Vivian directly, in the drawing room, with Whitfield present as witness, and her own reticule, searched, at Thomas's flat insistence, over her furious and increasingly shrill objections, producing a second piece of the Reed family's small jewelry that had gone quietly missing months earlier and never been reported, because no one had thought to connect its absence to anything but ordinary carelessness. "You would ruin an innocent woman," Thomas said, in the particular quiet voice of a man who has gone past shouting into something colder and considerably more final. "To remove a governess you decided was a threat to an arrangement I never agreed to in the first place. I want you to understand, Vivian, that I know precisely what you did, and precisely why, and that knowing it has ended whatever I once thought this family owed yours in courtesy." Vivian, to her credit, did not weep or plead. She simply looked at him with the flat, calculating expression of a woman recalculating a failed equation, gathered what remained of her dignity around herself like a coat, and left the Reed house that evening, never to be received there again, though, as those who knew her would later observe, Vivian Ashcroft was not a woman who accepted a single bad season as final, and something in her parting look suggested she had already begun composing her next arithmetic before she'd reached the door. Thomas did not wait for morning. He rode to town that same night, in the cold, without a coat, and spent the better part of an hour going door to door among the boarding houses before he found the right one, and the landlady, unimpressed by his fine coat's absence, made him wait on the step until she'd confirmed with the young woman upstairs that she was, in fact, willing to be found. He found Margaret in a small rented room with one trunk half-packed for a departure she hadn't yet decided the destination of, 3 unanswered letters to prospective employers laid out on the narrow bed beside her. He did not apologize prettily. He was not, by nature, a man of pretty apologies. He told her, plainly, standing in the doorway because she had not yet invited him further, what had happened, what Whitfield had found, what the scullery maid had seen, what Vivian's own reticule had produced, and what he had said to her before she left the house for good. He watched Margaret's face move through disbelief, and then something rawer, as 3 days of believing herself entirely alone in the world came undone all at once. "I should have trusted you before I had proof," he said. "I want you to know that. I believed you the moment Whitfield mentioned the ring. Not the proof, you understand. I was simply too much of a coward, that first night, to say so before I had something to show for it. You came all this way in the cold without a coat to tell me that," Margaret said, and something in her voice had gone unsteady in a way it rarely did. "I came all this way," Thomas said, "because I intend, if you'll allow it, to walk you back into that house myself, publicly, at the earliest possible occasion, so that everyone who looked away from you that Thursday is made to look directly at you instead. And because I found, somewhere around the 2nd mile, that I did not much care to wait until morning to say so." The earliest possible occasion turned out to be a ball 3 weeks later, hosted by a family who had not yet heard the full, corrected version of events, a fact Thomas had confirmed in advance, and, if the small, deliberate smile he wore that evening was any indication, was rather looking forward to correcting in person. Thomas arrived with Margaret Ellery on his arm, not Miss Ashcroft, whose absence from the guest list was its own quiet statement, and whose name, by then, had begun circulating through the county in a considerably less flattering version of events than she'd have chosen for herself. He made certain, over the course of the evening, that every person who had once treated Margaret as beneath their notice understood exactly who she was, whose daughter she'd been, and whose good name had been proven, publicly and beyond dispute, entirely intact. He introduced her, each time, not as the governess, and not even, yet, as anything he had not asked her permission to call her, simply as Miss Ellery, spoken with a weight and a warmth that made the old dismissals sound, in retrospect, like the small cruelties they had always been. Clara played her scales without a single mistake 3 days later, for an audience of exactly one, her new mother, seated beside her on the piano bench, patient as ever, though there was considerably less need for patience now than there had once been. The stutter had not vanished entirely, it never quite would. But it no longer arrived accompanied by fear, and that, Margaret had come to understand, was the only cure that had ever really mattered. The wedding was modest, by Reed standards, which still meant grander than anything Margaret's own family could once have afforded in their best years. Whitfield oversaw the arrangements with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had, in his own small way, engineered the entire outcome from a single observation about a ring, and allowed himself, at the edge of the reception, one rare and genuine smile as he watched the Baron lead his new Baroness onto the floor for the first dance. He had served the Reed house through a great many difficulties in 30 years. Vivian Ashcroft, he suspected, watching the newly married couple laugh together over some private joke, was unlikely to accept this particular defeat as final. She was not, in his long experience of families like hers, the sort who learned from a single lost season so much as the sort who studied it, carefully, for what to do differently the next time. Something told him, the same instinct that had once noticed a ring on a governess's hand and known exactly what to do with it, that Ironvale had not heard the last of that name. He was, as it happened, entirely correct.